Okay, good afternoon. If I can ask folks to come on in from coffee and tea and take your seats as we start up our final panel for CHOW 2014. We have a tremendous lineup to wrap up Capitol Hill Ocean Week. As we've done for previous panels, and as I've said before, our presenting sponsor is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. We, as a National Marine Sanctuary Foundation, partner primarily with National Marine Sanctuaries and the office that oversees the program, but we partner with NOAA offices across the agency. And as I've said repeatedly, the breadth of the work that NOAA does on both sides of the firmament, both sides of the horizon, really is a tremendous responsibility and an amazing amount of work that they do with a very limited budget and a very small staff. And so we'll start with the one NOAA video that has been produced for CHOW for their work. So just a reminder, we will have volunteers going up and down the aisles with question cards. Question cards have been on your seat. They will have blank cards if you would like. Write your questions down as you listen to the discussion, and they'll go up to Juliet as moderator and incorporate it into the discussion. Our final session of the year is our Leadership Roundtable, and we are really excited and honored to have this group of leaders that range across the sectors, business, conservation, public, private, to talk about challenges facing the future of the ocean and the United States as an ocean nation. And it's my great pleasure to introduce the moderator of the panel, someone who's been a veteran for many years of Capitol Hill Ocean Week and who has been with us as a speaker, as a moderator, and we're delighted to welcome her back once again, Juliet Eilperin. She's currently the Washington Post White House reporter. She's been on the environmental beat. She's got a very long career, which you can read in full detail in the bio in the program. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Juliet to lead us. Thank you, Juliet.
Thanks so much, Jason. So we have a fantastic panel here. As you can see, it's a testament to Capitol Hill's Ocean Week that we have so many people who want to come here and talk about these issues. So I'm briefly just going to explain who's up here on the panel in case they're not immediately recognizable, which I'm sure they are to many of you ocean geeks. But with that, Congressman Sam Farr from California, who obviously is a longtime ocean advocate.
Hey.
And, whose district is the envy of many other of the, members of Congress, but he's fought them off successfully through redistricting and other means. Then we have, next to him, we have NOAA's administrator, Dr. Catherine Sullivan, who's here. And once you're an astronaut, you're kind of a shoo-in for any government job you want. So that's how she obviously got confirmed.
My claim to fame is I went to college in Sam's district.
Okay, so clearly that also helped grease the wheels and testaments. Exactly. I mean, when you have slugs as your mascot, that also helps. Then Scott Gudes, who is Vice President of Legislative Affairs for Space Systems and Operations at Lockheed Martin and has also acted as acting NOAA administrator and has worked on the Hill for many years on these issues. Next to him, we have Nancy Knowlton, who's the Sant Chair for Marine Science at Smithsonian's Natural Museum of Natural History. And by her, we have Josh Reichert, who's Executive Vice President of the Pew Charitable Trust, has been working on these ocean policy issues also in the trenches for years. And at the end, we have Paul Holthus, who's founding president and CEO of the World Ocean Council. So, and you, of course, can read more about their bios in the program. And from now, we're going to dive in. And one thing, just to add to what Jason said, is that while we will absolutely be collecting cards, we also will be collecting online questions. So for everyone out there, if you have something you're dying to ask these folks, there'll be plenty of time for questions, and you can submit them online, and I'll be looking at those as well as I decide what to ask them. I think we're going to start with Dr. Sullivan and ask about As at NOAA, since you touch on several aspects of climate change with a focus on coastal resilience and sea level rise, can you talk about what you've been doing to help communities prepare for some of the impacts of climate change and as they relate specifically to the coast?
Sure. Well, one thing we've done is I looked around and I had, of course, about a year serving as acting administrator before confirmation to really take stock, talk to our folks, get out into the world and into communities and hear what's moving and what were the needs. And the upshot of all of that was we've enunciated a set of 4 focus areas, 4 priorities that will be the thrust of my tenure as administrator. And one of those is resilience. And our particular focus as NOAA is to provide the science and the information and the environmental intelligence, if you will, that helps communities become more resilient. When we say resilience in this context at NOAA, we mean simultaneously and always linked together societal, economic, and ecological resilience. Our view of this is you can't take one apart from the other really in any meaningful way. So what are we doing? A host of things. In a certain way, weather and storm forecasts that alert communities of an acute threat coming at them is about providing some of that coastal resilience. But on the longer time horizon, the science, the work we do with habitat restoration, our habitat blueprint are really right on point with informing and providing coastal resilience. We brought that really to bear, for example, in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, working hand in glove with FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers under the auspices of the President's Hurricane Sandy Recovery Task Force. And with the Army Corps, we laid out clearer rebuilding and development principles that help communities understand how to use both green infrastructure, if you will, nature's own defenses, in concert with gray infrastructure to provide some physical protection against storms and incoming surge and tide. You know, that I've seen various estimates that say that the cost of putting a mile of gray infrastructure up to armor ashore is about a factor of 10 higher than restoring natural defenses that can do substantially much of the same job and give you many other ecological service benefits in addition. So bringing that kind of information, helping to drive and focus the science, and as tends to be a lot of NOAA's niche, transform the scientific data and understanding into information that's really pertinent to actionable and action-oriented out in the real world where these decisions are being made. So that's one example. I could cite many others, but.
Since we're in Washington, we always need to talk about politics, and I want to talk about how an issue that used to be kind of a model of bipartisanship has evolved over time, to put it diplomatically. And I thought both Congressman Farr, you could talk about it from what you see right now, and then Scott could talk about it as someone who worked for both Democrats and Republicans over 17 years in terms of, both, what have you seen happening on these issues and what path forward do you see? We're seeing all these initiatives coming under the administration using executive authority, but what is the role for Congress given some of the divisions we've seen in recent years? So maybe you could start by doing that.
Well, obviously Congress has a role for everybody sitting on this panel in writing the laws and appropriating the money that runs the government. And right now we have a House divided, and I've never seen it like this. It's really dysfunctional. And I think that the breakdown is one, a lack of understanding, sort of the ignorance, the flat Earth concept, that disbelief in science and global warming, downplaying it. We even have members of Congress that are using the appropriations process, which we're debating those bills on the floor right now, to put in amendment after amendment that the administration may spend no money doing this or that. In fact, there's a provision in the bill that just went to the Senate saying that no money can be spent to implement the national ocean policy, put there by oil and gas Congressman member Flores from Texas, who doesn't have any coastline. The other side of that story, though, is what, and it's important to all of you, is what happened here on Tuesday night in a district here in Virginia, when Eric Cantor, the number 2 person in the Republican Party, was defeated by folks in his district. What it shows is all politics is local. And that if you really organize on a local level, you're more powerful than the most powerful people in Congress. And so it's two-way. My job is to educate legislators as to why things are broken or what's broken that needs fixing and why the sort of the fix is appropriate, is a smart thing to do. But at the same time, it's to educate the electorate that you really have to do this sales job in your district. If Mr. Flores, for example, was hearing from his constituents that they don't like what he's doing, and there's a lot of Texas A&M Sea Grant programs and things like that, and people responding to that and saying, we didn't elect you to Congress to go defeat these things. We think they're good for us and good for science and good for Texas. He wouldn't be doing because he'd be threatened that he might be canterized. So I think that what I always love coming to these CHOW meetings, CHOW, I grew up with that word in Argentina and Latin America, and it means goodbye. And I want to say, I hope this CHOW means goodbye to ignorance, because that's what we're all here about, is to try to learn how to apply the best science that we can collect to manage our ecosystems. So right now, it's a struggle, and I think the ball is back in the court of the electorate to try to move the agenda in Washington.
Scott, do you want to speak to?
Sure. So I had kind of a sugar-coated congressional career as a staffer, and Congressman will appreciate I was an appropriator, so I wasn't either a Democrat or Republican, I was just an appropriator. So I had the honor to work for first Ted Stevens of Alaska, and then I got my job saved by John Stennis of Mississippi, and then by Dan Inouye of Hawaii, and then Fritz Hollings asked me to come over from South Carolina, asked me to come over and run his Commerce Justice, what was then called the State Department appropriations bill, which included NOAA. And then I did that for quite some time before I went to NOAA, came back and actually worked for Judd Gregg of New Hampshire. So I had kind of a checkered career there. But all those individuals were quite passionate about the oceans and quite passionate about NOAA. I mean, if you wanted to see somebody who knew everything about NOAA, talk to Fritz Hollings sometime. He'd be driving over to his house in Isle of Palms and tell you about the bridge that got rebuilt after Hugo, and no water from this bridge went down there. You know, he knew about non-point source pollution before, way before.
Right.
So all of them were that way. We had climate programs in the bill, the actual, what we used to call, Global Program Office really got going in the late Bush administration. So that was there, and it got expanded quite a bit. And I don't think that I remember ever a partisan debate over that in the period of time that I worked there, including 2004 when I came back to run the appropriations bill for Judd Gregg before I went to the Budget Committee. So I do think that it has become an issue, a wedge issue, unnecessarily and wrongly. I think Dr. Sullivan, I watched one of her testimonies one time, there's a need to focus on the science, and it's kind of amazing that the science is debated. I think people want to jump to what's the solution. If it's anthropogenic forces, then what do you do about that right away and start questioning the science, because they don't want the result. And I think NOAA's job often is to do the science, to do the observations, to get the data, have the data from Mauna Loa since 1950, whatever, they have the ice core, but still there's a need to do that. And then I think probably if there's a way to try to get to a solution that's positive, it might be to look for the effects. And so some of this is semantics, but for example, sea level rise, which obviously is caused by climate change, it affects every coastal community in America. And you can see very conservative communities, if you want me to put it that way, like Newport Beach, California, which is, I don't think, ever elected a Democratic member in its history. It's maybe back before the 30s. But they're talking about trying to put up something like the Dutch have to deal with tidal surge because of sea level rise. And they get it. They get what that means to that type of community. And so I think there's a way to try to get to issues like that without just calling it climate change. I think the only other thing I would say is, in closing, is everywhere I go around our company, for example, people will say to me, why don't we have members who reach across the aisle and work together? Why is there all this partisanship? And what I tell them is, I agree, and that was my whole experience. But if you look at the way that Americans vote now, that's not how they're voting. And actually the canter election shows that totally, because you had a very conservative member from Richmond who was determined to be not conservative enough. And you can look at Lugar's election. You can go down the path, but members who do reach across the aisle increasingly, whether they're blue dog Democrats or whatever, are the ones who are being pushed out. So.
Now, we're also at a really interesting inflection point, I think, in terms of President Obama's record on oceans. He's now had enough time in the job. One can generally draw some conclusions. And we're also at a moment where the administration seems to be showing a renewed engagement, whether you look at the fact that John Podesta has joined the White House, has spoken here, has been engaged in the West Wing. When you look at the State Department conference that Secretary Kerry will be hosting next week, I was hoping the second half of the other wing of our panel could weigh in and talk a little about how you view the president's record on oceans at this point, and when you're looking ahead, what are some of the biggest questions that he and his advisors will be facing? And we can skip it, if Nancy doesn't want, we can skip to Josh and go on to Paul, and then Nancy's going to give us some optimism after we continue our depending on what they say, positive or negative trend that we have here in this panel. But why don't you talk a little about how you see things and what are some of the biggest challenges and what are some of the most significant things that could happen?
Well, I think I want to say something just about bipartisanship.
Sure.
Or the lack thereof. In terms of the recent discussion about monuments, it's very interesting to look at the monument that is being discussed to be expanded, and that monument was created by George W. Bush, in 2009, and actually the Western Pacific is an area of the world in which you can look back over 100 years, and you see it. Conservation actions being taken by a successive series of presidents, beginning with Theodore Roosevelt back in 1903, and then followed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Bill Clinton and Ronald Reagan. And so it's been an example of different presidents essentially making decisions about protecting an area of the world that is looked upon as being valuable from a natural resource perspective and worth protecting. And I think that there has been, I don't view the partisan divide on fisheries issues, for instance, as unbridgeable by any means. I think as we kind of take a look at the future, if we go back really 10 years and look at what's happened in this country in terms of the management of fisheries, we've come a very long way. And I think that there's been support for changes that have taken place by both Republicans and Democrats. People oftentimes say that we have the best managed fisheries laws in the world. And I think by and large that's true. That doesn't mean we have a long way yet to go. But we're now, decisions are being made about what is taken out of the water based on science, not on politics. And also we've got similar criteria that have been built into the notion of rebuilding stocks that are in bad shape. We have, if you take a look at the next 10 years, I think that there's a phenomenal amount of things that can be done. More areas can be protected in the United States. We're headed towards a world in which the whole challenge of addressing illegal fishing and what to do about interdicting vessels on the open, in the open ocean, dealing with the challenge of global warming and climate. 10 years from now or 15 years from now, I think the focus of attention on the protection of ocean resources in the United States is going to be very different than it's been in the past, mainly because of climate, changing pH levels in the water, and warming and the migration of species from one place to the next. for years, when one thought about the major impacts of human activity on the world's oceans, overfishing was, the principal one. Just the sheer amount of biomass that we've been taking out of the water every year, that's completely unsustainable. We still have that problem to contend with, particularly in other parts of the world, but it's going to be overshadowed by changes that are taking place as a result of climate.
And Paul, I was wondering if you could pick up on that and talk about, first of all, one of the areas that's changing the most due to climate, meaning the Arctic, and both, when your members are looking at what's going on there, both what is it that they see, what are the opportunities or the challenges they see there, and what are they looking for in terms of a policy response? The U.S. will be chairing the Arctic Council, I believe it's 2015. So, both what's it like on the ground, and then what kind of policy response are you looking at?
Yeah, well, thanks, Juliet. I'd like to sort of segue then from one of the key themes that's coming through here that I think transcends the year-to-year or administration-to-administration politics, and really provides what could and should be the sort of continuity in dealing with ocean issues, and that's the role of science. I think that's really where we all have the opportunity to have good working relationships amongst the industries and between industry and government and industry and other ocean stakeholders, and particularly the environment community, that there's a common ground, a common interest in having good data that shapes good science, and particularly then informs good risk assessment and risk management. And certainly nowhere, or one of the places where that does come into play right now, as you say, is the Arctic. And that's really one of the strongest, I think, common working areas for looking at the future of the Arctic. Obviously, there's a lot of concern about the kinds of economic activity that's starting to take place, where that's going. But what I think we can all feel is a way to work together on that is ensuring that we've got good information on what is going on and what those sort of trends mean, what kind of data and information would help us all shape the policies then that will guide responsible economic activity, and to really bring that to an operational aspect of the role of industry. In our development of the first ever multi-industry Arctic Business Leadership Group, by far the top priority identified by the various companies from shipping and fishing and oil and gas and others was their role in being able to collect and share data as they are up there with an increasing number of vessels and movements in and out and across the region. And we have a program called Smart Ocean, Smart Industries that is working to scale up the use of vessels, platforms on a global scale. But it was particularly, as I say, a priority by the industries interested and increasingly active in the Arctic to be collecting data that then feeds into organizations like NOAA. And there is already, in fact, 3 oil companies many years ago signed an agreement with NOAA to collect and share data as they operate there. That's the kind of productive, constructive working relationship that I think we should be focusing on, and using that to help shape the policies that will allow for that kind of reasonable, careful, considered expansion of economic activity in the Arctic and in the ocean situation in general.
Got it.
Juliet, I might,
sure, go,
I can just amplify a bit on that, because I think between the congressman's and Scott's comments and Paul's, you hear an important contrast that we should remember. And that is the debate. There is a highly politicized discussion slant argument here inside the Beltway. But when you go outside the Beltway, where real world people are trying to make smart infrastructure decisions that are going to affect their community for 30, 50, 70 years, where businesses are just trying to stay afloat, literally, economically, under changing conditions, it's a very different situation. And to make a dry land point to complement what Paul just said, NOAA also has a memorandum of understanding with the Western Governors Association. That is hardly the most liberal leaning of political groups, if you look at the elected members of the organization. But they are hearing from their ranchers, from their farmers, from their communities about the thirst they have and the real need they have for better information about drought, about long-term temperature trends, about the prospects for the business on the assumptions of yore that worked up until this point that are clearly shifting under their ground. yes, they say to us periodically, could you talk with us, please, without saying that pesky C word. But when it comes to the data, when it comes to information that can add value to their decision making, that's a real need that is known and felt throughout the country, and that's still in high demand.
And Nancy, I'm going to incorporate a question we got from our online audience and pose it to you, which is, how do we balance economics and environment in ocean management? And I thought you could talk about marine reserves and some of the success stories that you've seen on the ground that might address that particular concern.
Thanks, Jude. Thanks for getting me off the hook about evaluating President
It's all right.
Obama's record, because my bosses at the Smithsonian would have a collective heart attack. But I will say, just in a way of leading into your question, that one of the things that President Obama did say in his remarks about his climate policy was to quote Abraham Lincoln about the importance of public opinion. And essentially, without it, you can go nowhere, and with it, you can do anything. And that's, I think, one area where we do, as an ocean community, do a pretty mediocre job in terms of talking to people about what the hopeful side of ocean conservation is. It's just a fact that scary stories without solutions cause people to tune out, not turn out. And as a consequence, this unremitting, unending parade of doom and gloom stories over the last 20 years have really caused a lot of people to lose hope. And so to address that, I think it's incredibly important to talk about the successes we've had, which are actually quite a lot. It's just that they seem to somehow not get any traction. I don't know whether it's because of the if it bleeds, it leads sort of media mentality, sorry, Juliet, or whether we just once we solve one problem, we just forget about it and then go on to the next problem as if we never accomplished anything. And so I think the whole synergy between the role of government and the role of local people that we've been talking about on this panel depends incredibly strongly on people understanding that not only have things gotten better, but local communities, individual people can make a really big difference. And one of the best ways to do that is to actually talk about the stories of success. And that means not only just presenting graphs and figures, which some people like us geeky scientists, but a lot of people really don't care about, but also talking about the stories themselves, the individuals who recognize that things weren't as they should be and chose to make a difference. And so
tell us a story.
So here's a story. I mean, you think about what's going on with sharks, for example, around the world. It used to be nothing but doom and gloom about shark finning, and sharks were all going extinct, but increasingly around the world, people are taking steps, whether it be individual communities or governments or hotel chains, the governments in China, the hotel chains in the Far East, communities and the local scale and on the country scale, Palau, for example, where a study a couple of years ago showed that a dead shark was worth, on the order of hundreds of dollars, but a live shark was worth on the order of millions of dollars. So even if you don't have this kind of basic humanitarian sort of sympathy for sharks, which I do, but maybe not everyone does, it's just a dollar and cents issue. It doesn't make any sense to kill sharks when they're worth so much more alive and dead. And here in the United States, for example, in Southern California, it's been shown that we've seen now the result of changes in regulations about nearshore gill nets and reducing pollution, that who would have thought Southern California is where apex predators are coming back. And in many places, healthy ecosystems just translate into dollars. In fact, in general, that's a rule rather than the exception. So you shouldn't have to sort of have this, the question was whether there's a balance between managing resources and healthy ecosystems. Those two things go hand in hand.
Right. And Josh, since you convinced me to write an entire book, Demon Fish Travels Through the Hidden World of Sharks, and have been working on sharks for quite a long time, what do you think? Why do you think we have seen some movement on this, both in China itself and certainly here in the United States and some other countries in Europe?
Well, there's been a lot of targeted effort that's focused on sharks over the course of the past, 6, 7, 8 years. But sharks really present an opportunity. to convince heads of state that, as Nancy was indicating, it's from an economic perspective, it's a stupid thing to kill sharks. And many of these countries, Palau, Bahamas, the study that you mentioned, we contracted. Basically, when you look at the situation in the water, you have foreign vessels coming into these countries, taking their sharks, not landing them, finning them in the open ocean, turning around and leaving. There's no processing that's done locally. There's no sale that's done locally. There's nobody employed locally, in the business of processing sharks. Yet, it's really like walking into somebody's house and stealing their furniture, in the sense that a lot of these countries that have taken actions to create shark sanctuaries, actually a significant amount of revenue that they generate from ocean-based tourism or from people who basically go to dive, to snorkel, and they want to see the spectrum of marine life in a place. If you remove that whole upper tier of predators, you don't see that, and it becomes less attractive as a destination spot. So it is one example where you can really convince people who are in decision-making roles to look at the data, and it's not a difficult conceptual jump to get to the point where you look at the situation and say, you know something, there's nothing in this for our country, and in fact, we're losing money as a result of this business, and we're going to put a stop to it. And that decision has been made in actually now, I think, 10 nations around the world.
Yes, and Con.
I think that's really key for everybody to understand that I think the environmental movement, and certainly ocean protection movement, has got to start defining itself in economic terms. Everything in Washington is now about money. How much is it cost? How much is it worth? And we've always, sort of environmental movement has said, well, it's just, you got to hug trees because they're nice. And now, in California, the debate it's always been, well, we love trees. 50% of us love it horizontally and 50% like them vertical. Well, we've been able now to show that there's more value in vertical trees than horizontal trees. And I think we've seen that in being able to do that with whale watching, which has just transformed the sport fishing industry, which is much more lucrative with whale watching and less hassle than sport fishing. And so they've converted their boats to this. It's also the education opportunity, giving people access to watchable wildlife with interpretation. And I think that's what the shark movement does. And in fact, I've heard that the folks who produced Jaws now want to produce the movie again, only they want to make the mayor, not the shark, the evil character in the movie. Because the mayor was, we can't tell anybody about this because we need the money for our community, right? So I think that if we begin, a couple of things that really would help. One is to really begin to do taking the science that we have and interpreting it in ways. Apps is probably the best way to do it, of creating apps for every outdoor experience so that individuals can have access as we provide it, but with really smart information. So they come away knowledgeable about things, and they're going to become part of this political movement that is going to speak to the need for Congress to pay attention to science. Right now, the programs that support the NOAA are getting cut. The wet side is half of what it used to be. It's all going into weather. And what's behind weather? Not only there are hurricanes and tornadoes, but you know who sells the weather equipment? The military-industrial complex. You got a lot of lobbies on that. That's satellites and big, expensive equipment. So we need to begin putting things in balance. And I think the best way to do it is to make the argument that the value of, and the economic value, we actually have a center in my district at the Monterey Institute of International Center called the Center for Blue Economy. It's all about developing the economics of the ocean. And I think these are going to be, in fact, I carried a bill to create the first national park in the United States in the last 13 years. And when it got to the White House, the question was, how many jobs is this? Not that, oh, we can do a national park. I mean, 59 of them in the history of the United States. Kind of excitement about that was, how many jobs? We had to hustle.
What year was that?
That was last year. And so it was, and that was because the president was worried about the jobs agenda, rightfully so. But, you know, we had to hustle. We found it. We found the information. And it's been an incredible, now that we've sort of asked that question, we're getting all kinds of reports about these little places that were going out of business and jobs that were being lost that are now recovered because of the national park status. So I think that this is, if we're in an era of economics, we've got to begin, and price tags, and Congress is going to be debating it, we've got to show that the value of investment is equal to the value of recovery or destruction.
Do you want to speak a little to what?
Yeah, I actually want to loop the circle back to where Nancy started, not disagreeing with what was said in between, but come back to this point about focusing on affirmative and aspirational sides of the equation, and putting the argument only in economic terms can, if done badly, can leave that out. People want to be part of success. They want to feel like something they can do will matter and will be of value. And you know, the archetypal story that in the NOAA space that hammered this lesson home to me especially does come from physical hazards, from tsunamis, but a community in Northern California turned really quite around in its approach to thinking about the tsunami threat it faced and being ready for it. And it came out of a meteorologist, and it came out of meteorologists watching a shampoo commercial. And this light bulb went on. He said, you know, when they're trying to sell you shampoo, they don't show you the world's ugliest, most bedraggled and awful damaged hair. They don't wag their finger at you and say, unless you buy my shampoo, you're going to look like this. They show you who you want to be. They show you something you want to align with and be a part of. And they encourage you to join that movement. There have been great successes in the ocean. Are the problems still many? Yes. Is the scale of it all still large? Yes. It is our choice whether we lament how much more there is to do or celebrate what people have managed to come together and do and hold that out as beacons that can draw more effort and focus people on positive actions. That really is our choice as people who care about the oceans and have the different roles that the people in this room have.
And can you speak a little to the point that the congressman brought up about NOAA's wet side being half what it used to be? What's going on there, and what kind of practical impact does that have?
Well, I, of course, wrote down to go back and just double check those statistics. Our investments.
We're asking an astronaut to.
Exactly, it's all going up into the atmosphere. That's what. Go ahead.
Actually, if I'm betraying my astronaut biases, it will go out of the atmosphere, right?
That's true. You're right.
But you know, my bias, even as an astronaut, was to really a motivation was to gain an understanding of the Earth that matters here, in real lives, and bring it back home and make it matter to all of us who live on the planet, not just those few of us that get to look down on the planet from above. So yes, look, infrastructure, investments in observing infrastructure, whether it's National Science Foundation, you know, or NASA or NOAA, those are large-scale investments. And it is true that the proportion that we're having to invest in keeping key satellite programs on track right now is a larger proportion than I would wish it was of the NOAA total. And there are a set of factors behind that, one of which is when I was at NOAA as chief scientist, we kept our two key satellite programs out of phase with each other. So the annual need was was rather lower than now, and we're going to work our way back to that posture. What the absolute dollars are, I don't know, but we'll work through the infrastructure problems. If I look at where the program investments in science and service and stewardship are, taking both our research ships and satellites and fixed infrastructure out, we run about 50-50 in those investments in the agency. And we will pay attention to that balance and care about it. It is about the science, it is about the people and the services and bringing that information to bear on the questions and the issues that we're all really looking at. It's not about having satellites or weather stations just for that sake.
Okay, Scott, and then Josh are going to weigh in, and then we're going to...
So on the Joint Ocean Commission initiative, I always try to separate what I do for a living versus my views on this. So I have to do that here too. So.
Okay.
But what I would say is what makes NOAA unique, the American program, is actually that it is about the whole Earth system. That most countries around the world have a fisheries department, They might have a weather service group, but they're never together. In fact, when we were talking about climate, to understand climate and the effect on weather and the effect on communities without understanding the oceans is impossible. And in fact, without, whether it's terrestrial-based or space-based systems, you're not going to have the data you need to do that. So there are a number of people here who use sea surface temperatures in their work or changes. Fishing uses that sort of boundary layer. That's from satellites. Low Earth orbit satellites, not the type that I work on, but the fact is it's the most efficient way to get those sort of measurements. And there was a time where we had weather ships before we had satellites, but and those things are expensive, but a satellite today might last 15 years. Early 90s might have lasted 3 years. There's a big difference in that in terms of amortization, but it is space across, whether it's NASA or Department of Defense, is not an inexpensive part of the business. And then the other thing I'd say is that I always felt when I worked at NOAA, and I felt that way when I worked on NOAA appropriations, that among the most important responsibilities is the infrastructure of the agency to get the data. It's also some of the hardest stuff because you have to be way ahead of time. But whether it's an in situ measurement of an Argo float or a Toga Tau array, or we're talking about ports, or we're talking about river forecast centers, or satellites, or radars, these are among the most expensive things, I think, that the agency has to do, but they're also among the most critical. Because if you don't have the data, and you don't have the quality of the data, then all those other things we do, like telling a community where that hurricane is going to go, we can't do it.
Yeah.
So that's
And I would just pile on and add a role that has been appointed to NOAA is to be that infrastructure provider for the entire United States. So for the academic community, for every other department and agency, increasingly the data from our satellites and fixed infrastructure are feeding the Defense Department's environmental needs as well. So.
Well, my frustration, though, is that the Defense Department has duplicative satellites doing weather also. I mean, the Navy's operating totally independently of NOAA, and the Air Force is operating totally independent. They're doing all their weather all over the world, forecasting live. I mean, there ought to be more sharing of this. This is big, expensive stuff. And anyway,
Sam,
if we don't do that, we're going to have to just take the O out of NOAA and just call it NAW.
Now you sound like Sarah Hollings did O&O.
So just a factual
Very
correction.
briefly, and then we're
Factual
going on
correction.
to Jason.
The Air Force does not do global weather predictions at all anymore. They're out of that for just the reasons you cited. And NOAA has adjusted what we do in ocean modeling to be complementary and not duplicative of the Navy. I think that was true in the early 90s. It's not true today.
Okay, Josh, you get to chime in, and then we're going to go on to some more questions. And sorry, we will let Paul go after Josh. Yes.
Just a couple of points. One is that, at the risk of being unpopular in an audience like this, a lot of what we face out there in terms of challenges really relates to a lack of political will. Good science is always helpful. And I would be the last person to argue that we don't need more of it. But at the end of the day, we have a pretty good grasp of what a lot of these problems are and how to fix them. And the failure to fix them is much less due to ignorance about what the problems are and what to do about them than it is a simple lack of political will to get on with the job of fixing them. The second is that economics, it's much easier to deal with problems when they haven't reached a state of crisis. It's much easier to think about the management of fisheries into the future when the patient is not essentially almost dead. Because when that happens, there's a crisis. And usually in order to deal with that crisis, there's winners and there's losers, and there's a fair number of losers. And trying to fix that problem and do management planning in the midst of one crisis after the next, it makes the job of dealing with the ocean environment more complicated. And finally, it is important to emphasize the fact that to emphasize hope, and that there's a lot of these things that we can fix. But at the same time, I think it's important not to underestimate the nature of the problems we face, and to put a rosy glow on issues that are of profound consequence if we don't fix them soon.
Got it. All right, Paul, did you want to chime in? And then I've got a very thick stack of smart questions that I'm dying to ask you people when you stop talking. But please, go ahead.
Well, I was timing this event to see how long it would take before your book came up, and it got in there very early.
I didn't know up in the introduction. A girl's got to work. All right, go ahead.
So, and it's a great book. So
Thank you.
good.
Thank you for the testimonial. I appreciate it.
I think and actually building on what Josh said too, this issue of political will, and if you start peeling back the layers on that, it's often about who is working to or who is interested in supporting and ensuring that that things move forward. And this really gets to this role of success and the economics of this. And there's really a third narrative about the ocean that the media, I think, doesn't really capture. There's huge success and I'm coming from a history of having worked on marine parks and marine science myself, and totally reoriented my efforts to focus on the role of the private sector. There's huge successes over the decades in different of the industry sectors and different companies doing a great job of identifying their impacts and working on them. Look at the data on chronic and major accidents from oil tankers. I mean, there's a hugely impressive record of that industry really cleaning up its act, and a mix of environment, political, and global scale efforts to take care of that issue. So that third narrative is really about the role of the ocean as an economic resource. All of those goods and services we all as society depend upon, the men and women who are often risking their lives and sometimes losing their lives to bring us fish, food, protein, energy, affordable maritime transport that makes this modern consumer society really possible. And I think that linking that sort of economic activity and the interest of good people and good companies to work on solutions then can lead to the sort of political will on the sort of technology, innovation, and solutions we need, and the support. And it's not an either-or case, as was being pointed out, of atmospheric observations versus sea. If you can harness the interest of the business community, they will support all of those efforts that are needed to make a safe and sustainable and workable ocean environment. It's a difficult and dangerous place to do business. We need the role of government in providing that sort of data, the observations, the predictions, to make it increasingly safe and sustainable. And I think that's where you get this harmonization and political will to move forward on things.
Great. And so that'll lead into one quick question I want to ask, and then I'm going to combine a couple. But so one question from audience is, shouldn't we focus more on corporations rather than the public? An economic argument is likely to be more impactful with them. So is there anything, Paul kind of alluded to it, are there, again, concrete examples of either where you feel like focusing on corporations has made a real difference, or also, what's the boundary? Where's the limit where that doesn't work and where it does? So
just to
yes.
lead off,
Why
I
don't
mean,
you
that
go?
really is emphasizing the point I was just making then, and I think there's particular role for in government to help incentivize the R&D in more of a combined agenda with the business community on the sorts of innovation and technology that can lead to solutions, and really thinking about the role of the public sector in helping harness and align agendas on solutions to some of these broad cross-cutting issues that are affecting the health of the ocean. We're not going to solve a lot of the ills of the ocean by just protecting areas. We've got to manage the impacts, the cross-cutting impacts. We're not going to have an enforcement officer on every vessel out there. We need corporations to be leading the way. And as I say, there are good companies that really want to help figure that stuff out, and we need to think about the role of government in incentivizing, partnering, to help make that, to accelerate that and make it more possible.
Scott, do you want to?
I was thinking about what the congressman was saying before about that it's about economics, and I think that's right. So if you take a look at my own company, we're doing tidal energy, wave energy, ocean thermal energy conversion projects because there's a market, though not out of because it's a nice thing to do. They tend to be what we're doing in Australia and other countries, but those things are happening. As far as
And is that market driven by government mandates and incentives, or is it just based on?
it's actually other countries have decided that to answer your question, I probably don't know how much is the government money versus private entities in those. I think it is private entities in those areas, but you may be right.
Okay.
If it is government, I don't know the answer.
Right, okay.
So is there a market there? Companies are going to go for that. In fisheries, clearly a number of companies have made a difference by saying they want to adopt sustainable fisheries.
Right.
There's been a big change there, clearly. And the other thing I would say is going to the economic interest. If you were to visit our Sunnyvale, again, I'm just talking from Lockheed Martin now, but if you visit our Sunnyvale facility, for example, it's very much renewable energy. And that's because the company decided that that made interest for us. It's not that far from the congressman's districts, but it made it sense for us to do that. So you find a lot of solar power, for example, that we use ourselves for our business. I think companies, corporations are part of any solution. To go back to the question, I don't think they're an exclusive
Got
issue.
it. Congressman, you wanted to weigh in.
I think what's overlooked often in the private sector is the driving force of casualty insurance companies who are now listening to science, to saying, why should we be insuring bad practices? It's going to cost us money. The oil shipping lines after the Exxon Valdez that we changed in California to assure that it was the casualty insurance companies that got together with the environmental community saying if there's an oil spill close to shore in the central part of California that I represent, it's going to be disastrous costs because that's where the most flora and fauna of nearshore activity is. So they encourage insurance companies to join with us in moving the shipping lanes farther out. Costs more money because it's a longer trip and all of that, time and money, but it was the insurance companies that were sort of pushing the oil companies to adopt that practice. And I thought it was very interesting, and it's going to be, as we see the effects of hurricanes, floods, and we know more about the science and path of prediction, I think that you're going to see zoning practices change at the local level where you're not going to go back and do dum-dum over again because insurance companies aren't going to insure it.
And I think you're starting to see that emerge in longer timescales in terms of looking at future risks and adjusting the actuarial and catastrophe modeling practices further down the road.
Exactly, Nancy.
Well, but I would like to say, sort of to complement this, that it's not just the political will, which Josh mentioned was lacking for some of these things, but sometimes corporate decisions are also influenced by public perception. So to say you can do it only on one side, I mean, I agree with you completely. A public consensus for the ocean would go a long way, not only to solving some of the political problems, but also shaping corporate behavior in a way that might be more ocean friendly.
Got it. Okay, so I'm going to combine, we've got a couple sets of 2 questions, which people can weigh in on. We've had a presidential executive order and a national policy declaring that we should do a better job collaborating to make good decisions about the uses and protections of our ocean resources. If we don't start to move forward at a greatly accelerated pace in several parts of the country and have real results in terms of better decisions and outcomes, how can we sell the importance of this work to the next president? There are only 2 years left. Actually, I'll take that alone, and then I'm going to ask some other ones. But so obviously, what do we need to see in concrete terms in terms of the national ocean policy? And I do actually think it's worth segueing to some extent into the 2016 election and saying, what sort of realistic mobilization would have to happen in order to make this a priority?
Well, I wrote that bill, and then we tried many years, and Republicans were in the majority, so I went to my Republican colleagues, Jim Greenwood, to Jim Saxton, to Wayne Gilchrist, all very sort of environmentally oriented, ocean-sensitive legislators who put their name on it because my name wasn't going to get a hearing. The Republican committee wouldn't even hear their own bills. We spent about 6 years trying to, with the Joint Oceans Commission, lobbying it, saying, look, these are 2 great studies that have been done. Pew Charitable Trust and the Oceans Commission by government have made all these recommendations to upgrade the entire and reenact the ocean policies for the country. We need a national ocean policy. Congress had only twice in history developed national environmental policy: the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. And essentially, it was do no harm. And so that was the goal of trying to figure out how do we do no harm to the ocean and how do we develop a policy for that. It never got enacted. So the boldness of President Obama was to do it by executive order. And 90% of that bill is in the executive order. All of the members of Congress either were defeated, the Republican moderates, or left. There's no voice there for the oceans on the Republican side anymore. And what they're doing is trying to stop the president from and doing whatever this national ocean policy does. I mean, they haven't even looked at it. And understanding that the oil companies were involved in recommending these recommendations, it's stuck. And now because we didn't enact it, let's not let the president do it. And that's why this bill that says don't spend any money to implement the national ocean policy has passed the House. And hopefully in conference, the Senate will have the wisdom and knock it out. We got it knocked out last year. But I think that this is what I was trying to lead with, is that we need to have some political ownership. If Congress felt that having a national ocean policy was important, they wouldn't deal with it. They'd allow it to go and work it out, and then we'd debate whatever controversies came out of it, but not just to kill the idea because it is an Obama idea.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on national ocean policy? And Paul, can you talk a little bit about what is, since you represent, right, some of these industries that are affected by it, do you think it's a good thing, a bad thing? What's your sense of how it's affecting the way your members operate now?
Well, I think part of the issue has been that as that was first developed, and the World Ocean Council was just getting going at that time, we had reached out to NOAA and some of the other agencies to really encourage that there's a very proactive outreach and engagement to the business community on this. Mm-hmm. And I think there's and I've had actually people tell me off the record that they feel like that could have been done a lot better, so that there were partnerships and interest, and this gets back to this political will question, that there were people and companies that had an interest in at least understanding the opportunity and the potential of working at a policy level nationally and on some of the more specific aspects of what's been included in that. And so now it's been a bit of a difficult task in kind of recovering from that lack of I think really proactive and systematic engagement of the business community to try and build that trust and involvement. But I can certainly tell you that there are people and companies that do want to see some of that, different forms of that moving forward. And unfortunately, they've been maybe keeping a bit of a low profile in the face of some of the other things that gain traction in the meantime. Mm-hmm. And so we need to find those people and work with them, as I was saying earlier, on common areas of common interest, such as the science and the data, the mapping, the kinds of things that lead to and it's cliche, but it's really true, that lead to that stability and predictability which the business community really wants to see, and focus on the sort of things that, in their language, that make things like national ocean policy work with and for them.
I was just going to add, I think there will still be some movement in the next 2 years, and I think part of where it will come from is regions. New England comes to mind, Mid-Atlantic come to mind, at least with respect to coastal zone development and nearshore and coastal resilience issues, recognize the opportunity and the tools that are in the national ocean policy for them, and are taking them up and moving forward on plans that will make better decisions in their regions. I think those have a prospect of serving as valuable touchstones, maybe not of the scale and scope the questioner would hope.
Right.
But again, we need to take those ones that do come forward and move with them and build on them as best we can.
Got it. Scott,
Just pivoting off of what Dr. Sullivan said, the Joint Ocean Commission is going to hold regional sessions, roundtables with stakeholders to take a look at what's actually going on in different regions and talk about what the needs are. Pivots exactly off of that. So while the federal government maybe have its issues, there's a lot going on, including in California, Monterey Bay, which is probably one of the most progressive areas.
Okay. Josh, go ahead.
I think we need to do a better job of educating the public about what the consequences are to human society about letting these systems decline. And it's important to remember that these are public resources. And the decisions that are made about the use of those resources should be government decisions. government has a fundamental responsibility to make decisions about the use of the marine environment which benefit the public as a whole, and that are not driven by any single constituency. And I, to be honest, I think that part of our job in the not-for-profit community is to hold government's feet to the fire and make sure that those decisions are made in a timely and productive way for society as a whole.
Okay, next question. The Antiquities Act of 1906, monument designations, has such limited authority/regulatory capability. Why consider monuments versus sanctuaries that have a broader, deeper legislative authority? We have one of our most fiercest sanctuaries proponents in the front row, so just be careful when you answer that question. But what would people say when looking at sanctuaries versus monuments? What are some of the pros and cons of those two? Who wants to take that question?
Well, I'll let people who know the details of those statutes better than I confess I do have that arcane of a debate. But I would say, from NOAA's point of view, those are each two different pathways to set aside with various conditions, areas of special significance, ecological, cultural, scientific significance. We work quite closely, hand in glove, with the Interior Department in almost all of those designations through whichever path they come. Right. And there are examples of moving first by an executive action under the Antiquities Act to declare a monument, and then NOAA coming in subsequently with the sort of grassroots and participative process that fleshes out the way in which the affected communities and regions want to govern that, and converting it even to a sanctuary. So we don't necessarily have to be as binary in looking at that.
Sanctuaries have to be established by Congress, right? Or can they?
No, sanctuaries can be administrative, but and monuments can be administrative. Only parks have to be Congress.
Could be, right.
But thank God
And
they have
wilderness
these
areas,
two authorities. And wilderness areas can be done by either Congress or... no, well, I don't know with the wilderness area. I think the wilderness has to be Congress, but the monument for BLM lands is equivalent to wilderness.
Got it.
It can be done administratively.
Okay.
Thank God for both of those authorities. The best thing is we're going to be able to now see what the marketplace feels about it, not just the politics inside the Capitol, because the president just announced that he's going to open up the sanctuaries for nominations. You have a chance to organize your community where there's a high interest and say, we'd like a sanctuary in our ocean area. And you can nominate them. It's like applying for a grant with the federal government. You're going to have to go through a process. But what a great opportunity to put this back in the hands of the people rather than the hands of people in Washington who fear both the word sanctuary and Antiquities Act and all those things and think this is some big conspiracy for the federal government to grab land and take away your sovereignty and invite the United Nations to come and camp on your property.
There you go. Josh, what do you want to say about that?
Well, it's a similar kind of concept to the one I talked about before. We're dealing with public lands or water. And there's a lot of instances in which you go through a legislative process, but there's somebody or somebodies who are going to fight every one of these tooth and nail. And thank God for the fact that presidents of the United States can make a decision. It's usually made right before they turn out the lights and hand over the White House to the next president. But there are places that will be opposed by the fishing community, by the oil and gas industry, by the ranching or mining communities, and that trying to get them protected in a comprehensive way is almost impossible because of really localized opposition. But when we remember that the overall purpose being served here is the country as a whole. You know, if you go back and look at every major national park, really from Yellowstone on, and Yellowstone was done in 1872. If we had waited 30 or 40 years to create that park, it probably never would have happened. So there's a lot of instances in which we need leadership to make certain kinds of decisions. You look back on those parks as part of the natural endowment of the country. And while they were fought over bitterly at the time that they were in the process of being designated, people look at them now, 10, 15, 20, 100 years later, and say, thank God they're there.
Okay, so we have two questions which I wanted to bring together, which is, the ocean may be divided by legal constructs into country waters on international waters, but ecologically it is a huge Earth system. What leadership could the U.S. take to ensure ocean health globally? And the second question, which amazingly I did not plant, is Sweden has an ambassador for oceans. Why are we, the USA, so much behind Europe? And I have to say, she's my friend. She's awesome. Her name is Lisa Svensson. You should all learn about her. She is the first ocean ambassador. And I'm curious of if people could chime in on both, what do we need to do to demonstrate leadership, and why do we not have an ambassador? Why is Sweden surpassing the United States in this area? And it maybe Paul knows Lisa Svensson too, or maybe not.
Really well. But
Okay.
I'd also say, if you look back a bit, in fact, back when I was with UNEP, I think Australia had an oceans ambassador back in 1990 or so.
And then they scrapped that whole idea.
Right. But
Okay.
just for the record, just to make sure we're being consistent and correct in our information. And Lisa's great, and I think this is a part of the wave of the future, is more countries investing in that kind of international approach to oceans through that sort of political commitment, and maybe that's part of what we'll start to see in the U.S. But I do want to highlight that first question and the international and transboundary aspects, and I think one thing is to recognize what the U.S. is already doing, and particularly with regards to science and observations. One of the figures I saw was that something like 40% of the world's work on ocean observations is directly linked back to the U.S. government and NOAA. I mean, and the rest of the world really needs to recognize the role that all of you as taxpayers are doing to support our understanding of the oceans on a global scale. And I think we certainly need to continue that role and accentuate it. And on a transboundary level, there's some particular opportunities coming forward. I've just come from a meeting yesterday in Brussels, the second meeting of the stakeholders on the Galway agreement, which is an agreement that was signed last year between the US, Canada, and Europe to really look at a much more proactive collaboration on the science, the observations, and the management of the North Atlantic. And I think it's those sort of partnerships that can really help bring home and as well as advance the work on the transboundary nature of the issues, and link it specifically back to each country's domestic interests, but also recognize that these things can be dealt with within the political boundaries, obviously.
Nancy, do you want to weigh in?
Well, there are different kinds of leadership. There's leadership from officially elected people. I was just actually at a meeting at the Vatican on sustainability, and the Pope is a kind of leader in a planetary sense as well. And he talked after the meeting. He made a pronouncement, and he said that we should take care of creation, because if we don't take care of creation, creation will destroy us. And I think this whole, and one of the things that was said during this meeting by one of the participants was, in terms of social movements, he said, the success of every social movement in the history of humankind has seemed impossible until it became inevitable. And I think we really behooves us not to underestimate the potential for tipping points and not take our current situation and think that we have to simply extrapolate linearly in terms of thinking what the future will be like. Things can change very, very fast, and we've seen some examples of that in the United States, actually, for good and for bad in the last decade.
Yes, Scott.
So do you think maybe the Washington Post just scooped John Kerry? Maybe there's a deliverable next week to create an ocean ambassador. Maybe hear from the State Department.
So we did get a
Great
question.
idea.
The question is,
This is a
isn't
great
David
idea.
Bolton the
But don't do the
ocean
legislation.
ambassador for the U.S. State Department? But he is not. Okay. And who is mentioned in the book, Demon Fish?
He does hold ambassadorial rank and the position of ocean, environment, and science. So it's,
Sort of.
give him some slack.
Yeah,
If you
Deputy
don't-
Assistant
if you're
Secretary.
if you're not a signature to the law of the city, what do you
Yeah.
see? What do you have to ambassador for?
Okay. So, which leads us into our next question. Nicely. There are stateless ambassadors, I should point out, but I don't want to get into Mideast politics. So now we go on to, what are the chances that the USA will ever be a signatory to the Law of the Sea to allow our...
Mr. Farr?
To allow our Article 76 to be submitted? That's a Senate question, let's be fair.
That's a Senate question.
And then just to add on to that, from our online audience, with all the changes in the Arctic, what are the best practices in ocean management with an area that is undergoing drastic change? So people can take their pick of whether they want to weigh in on Law of the Sea, or which has been, of course, promoted by both the Bush administration and the Obama administration to little effect, or they can tackle anything else they wanted to say about the Arctic at this moment. Do you want to?
Well, the only comment we have in the House is that, the opposition party is a problem, but the Senate is the enemy. So I'll defer to the Senate to defend, and somebody who has some inside knowledge. There's no common sense explanation I've heard yet of why the Senate can't ratify the Law of the Sea. It's the #1 request of the United States Navy as a national security issue, and we can't get the Senate ratification.
And there's certainly good business support for that as well. It's come out year after year. So that's
That's not the problem.
That's not the problem either. So it's
So nobody on the panel is going to say why that's a good idea. So
All right, we're not.
it's a wedge. It's become a,
Yes,
like you
go
said,
ahead.
the C when Kathy said the C word. It's the Law of the Sea for some people has been a rallying point. John Kerry made a huge effort when he was still chairman of Foreign Relations to get it through. Our company and a number of companies are major advocates of it, and I can't explain either why that's viewed as we're giving away sovereignty. So.
Okay, Josh, you want to?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about the Arctic.
Please, talk about the Arctic.
I think that the Arctic is now facing huge pressure. I mean, on the systems there, and that's not going to go away. It's going to get worse. So, and the way to deal with that pressure, principally, is reduce CO2 emissions. But in the meantime, I think we have to avoid adding further stress to that system, which means as areas of the Arctic are opened up to industrial fishing, I think we have to freeze the footprint of fishing there. And I think we have to take precautionary measures which will provide buffers to the more dramatic impacts of climate change there.
Okay, Nancy, can you talk about reducing the pressures on ecosystems and how we've seen that play out?
Well, I would second that. Just that I work on coral reefs, which is the exact opposite of the Arctic. But in the coral reefs, we see a very clear pattern, which I think is true of the oceans in general, which is, yes, climate change has done a lot of damage and will progressively do more damage, and the same is true of ocean acidification. But it's also true that on a local scale, managing fishing appropriately and controlling pollution does an enormous amount to build resilience, which was mentioned in the beginning. There are plenty of unbelievably, spectacularly beautiful reefs still on the planet. I spent a month in the Southern Line Islands, and the bottom is covered with 100% living coral, and there are sharks and groupers and snappers and manta rays everywhere in the water, and those places exist. And the reason, they're important to protect just because they're spectacular windows on what the ocean used to look like before we started screwing it up. But it's also a very important lesson, which is those places are not protected from global warming, and they are not protected from ocean acidification, and yet they still look absolutely fantastic. The same is true on the Great Barrier Reef, where there's been a lot of press recently, relatively recently, about problems in the Great Barrier Reef, not just the opening of a coal port, but also the steady degradation of reefs within the Great Barrier Reef system. But if you look at where that degradation is occurring, it's occurring close to shore, where people are. And the outer reefs of the Great Barrier Reef are actually still in really good condition. So both of those are examples of how if you manage local threats, you buy time while we grapple with a much harder challenge of dealing with a carbon-based economy and what it's doing to the...
And by the way, did the Pope I'm just curious, this is a random question, but did the Pope talk a bunch about oceans when you were there? I'm just curious.
He didn't actually talk about oceans,
Okay.
no. He came in, we were introduced to the Pope. It was actually cool, but...
Everyone's a Pope.
I even have a picture of me with Pope. But but mainly it was after about a week or so afterwards, he made this statement about the importance of protecting creation, and he's very interested. I mean, who knows why he's interested? He's obviously interested in poor people, and what hasn't been actually talked about much in this session, because of course we're in Washington, it's a U.S. focus, but poor people around the world are the ones who suffer the most as the ocean degrades, and he cares desperately about the plight of the population of the planet that is not wealthy and is suffering, and protecting creation will protect them.
Yes,
Just
Scott.
one quick comment about the Arctic. In 2001, May of 2001, Senator Stevens, who was then the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, held a hearing on climate change in the Arctic in Alaska, up at the University of Alaska. And Dan Golden was the head of NASA, me as the acting for NOAA, USGS went up and testified, and then he had a whole day of local people in Alaska testifying, extremely concerned about the impact on Native Alaskan communities from coastal storms.
Right.
Sort of the same issue that we're talking about here. And the data was overwhelming in terms of how much wetter and warmer that Alaska had become. And Tom Carl came, and it was quite some time ago, and it goes back to the first point we talked about, that there was nothing about the C word being, a problem. We talked about that. Mm-hmm. Now, fast forward a few years later, and the Joint Ocean Commission got together a number of stakeholders about 2 years ago, I guess, to say what are the most important issues that the legacy of the Ocean Commission should focus on. And of the four, the Arctic is one of those, because uniformly across the stakeholder community, people realize the importance of what's going on there.
Got it. Paul, did you want to chime in, and then we'll go on?
Just on the Arctic as well, your question was specifically, the question that you had was specifically about best practices, and that's the second priority after, and I mentioned the interest in science and data collection and sharing was what came out of our Arctic Business Leadership Group as it continues to develop. The second task area that we're working on now is the development of circumpolar business practices and standards, and certainly working with the Arctic Council and the various, well, starting with Sweden, they were particularly interested in helping get that going. This development of a business dialogue then between the governments and the business community. So we've got different companies from different sectors starting to develop those kinds of practices to help guide the responsible and cautionary movement into the Arctic. More is going to happen there, and better to have the business community thinking and working together on those, and we certainly look to the U.S. leadership of the Arctic Council to be a partner in that as we work with the governments on that kind of really responsible and careful development of the economic activities that are going to happen to some extent one way or the other. Better to have this kind of proactive, constructive engagement of industry on that.
Got it. I think we can dispatch with quickly, but for Congressman Farr, the question is it time to bring back the House Merchant Marine and Fisheries Committee, maybe with a better name? So if you...
Yes.
There you go. Democrats to control, that might happen. Okay. From our online audience, how can agencies, and this certainly I think Administrator Sullivan could start this off. How can agencies manage both the commercial and recreational fisheries separately but equally? They are both very different and require different management, yet under the Magnuson-Stevens Act, they are managed the same. Do you have any thoughts on that? And then anyone else can chime in.
Well, I think, California's a great example, because what essentially California has done is take charge of the nearshore jurisdiction that they have, which is where all those sport fisheries are. The commercial fisheries are they go much farther out. And what we've done is created marine protected zones and sort of no-take zones of anything versus take some things versus do other things. I mean, there's sort of a category of A, B, C's, and D's of marine protected zones from Oregon to Mexican border. And the fishery folks weren't involved in the first set and got really upset and realized that they were either going to be part of the problem or part of the solution, and got involved and started helping design these things. I think it's a good example. We were talking about regional leadership here. That's what's going to happen in the next decade. I think Washington is stuck. We're going to have to sort of work with the states. And I think California, almost every area of the science of the seas, is taking a state lead and pushed by local governments the Santa Barbaras and Monterey's and Santa Cruz's of the world, San Francisco Bay Area. We're expanding our national marine sanctuary. I think if we made it to the public, they'd create a sanctuary from the Oregon border all the way to Mexico. They'd like the whole coastline to be a sanctuary, just because they appreciate what that means, and it also is very helpful in tourism and attraction for that. So I think that the administration, as you said, it's a different administrative activities and science and how that's applied. And frankly, I think between NOAA and the California Fish and Game Commission, we've done a remarkably good job.
And we see some similar innovations. I'll confess, not as progressive as California in the interest of courtesy to my neighbor here on the panel. But we see that kind of regional interaction in a number of areas around the country. They are different fisheries. We do have different engagements and dialogues with them. We're beginning to move out now with a recreational fisheries policy in response to the rec fish community, and acknowledging that it'd be good to enunciate those facets that are distinctly and legitimately different. So we're working.
But when are you going to finalize that?
We just announced the start of that at the Recreational Fisheries
Right.
Summit a couple of months ago. It'll be done, I think it was by the end of this year.
Got it. Okay, what about ocean trash? There's plastic and fish we eat, there are beaches with trash, and according to this questioner, there's 1 million sea creatures who die every year. Could anyone talk? That's going to be one of the topics of the State Department's conference next week. Does anyone have anything?
Well, my comment on it is that I carried the bill to reauthorize the ocean trash authorization to allow the Coast Guard and other federal agencies to work in cleaning up the ocean. And very little money. I think there's only $4 million in it. Nobody thought it was an issue until a Malaysian airline couldn't be found. And all of a sudden, all you could find in the ocean was trash. Found everything but the airline. And where'd they find it? In the middle of nowhere where nothing is out there. So how the heck did that trash get there? I think we have now got a new understanding of how extensive this ocean trash problem is. And frankly, one of the best conferences I've been to is that international now, I guess, ocean trash. I call it the trash conference. But you're seeing a lot of private sector involvement. Interesting companies like Coca-Cola are one of the sponsors of this, because they realize that plastics that they use for bottles are not going to be very socially popular anymore. So they're investing heavily into a biodegradable bottle. And people are starting to ban plastics in all these communities up and down the coast faster than the industry can manage it. So I think we've got a new attention to ocean trash. We just don't have much money to deal with it.
Yes.
And I think this is the kind of innovation that these issues will drive in the business community, and I think the plastics industry is a lot of players there are really responding to this challenge, recognizing that by some estimates 80% of that debris is coming from land-based sources. So it's really a land waste management issue, and I think that's a lot of the attention and effort needs to focus on that, particularly in developing countries where the need and capacity is greatest. For the part of that marine debris and ocean waste issue that is emanating from ship and vessel-based sources, part of the conundrum is again a political one and a role of governments. There's a lot of the leading international companies are being required increasingly through MARPOL to deal with their waste, and things aren't going overboard and certainly aren't meant to go overboard. The connection is you need a shore-based facility, you need port reception facilities to handle that waste. So while we have the regulatory environment ratcheting up for what's required of industry, the requirements of governments to actually supply the shore-based facilities is sort of a soft law encouraging of governments to do what they need to do, and that's not happening. And so we have very good companies actually being squeezed by this requirement for which the capacity is not there. And particularly in semi-enclosed seas like the Mediterranean and the Caribbean, we really need a strategic approach to having the sort of shore-based port reception facilities to handle that waste, because companies will comply, but we need the partnerships with government to make that possible.
Okay, well, if no one else has any comments, I'd like you to join me in thanking our panelists for sharing their insights with us today.
I too would like to echo the thanks for all of the panelists. I'd like to thank Juliet as well. And I'd like you to indulge me with just a couple of closing remarks for CHOW 2014. Over the last 2.5 days, we've seen an awful lot of discussion. We've seen a couple of big policy announcements, one by John Podesta on behalf of the administration, one by Senator Levin with a new bill that he will be pushing forward over the next couple of months before he retires. We've had some riveting, insightful, important discussions over the last couple of days among the nation's leading experts on these issues. We've seen some provocative challenges, particularly on this panel, to conventional thinking on the ocean. The one thing we were missing is what you hear downstairs. It's the enthusiasm of the World Cup playing in Brazil in the inaugural game. And when we get cheers like this for ratifying Law of the Sea and for passing a Magnuson-Stevens conservation bill on behalf of fisheries, then we know we will have succeeded. But we are getting there. We are getting there. As you know, hosting CHOW is a great opportunity for the foundation. It's also a great responsibility, one we take very seriously, particularly with our partnership with the agency that oversees these issues, NOAA. I want to give you a sense of the numbers that we've seen over the last couple of days and that have grown over the years. This year, like the last 2 years, we've had more than 650 register. That's a far cry from the 400 plus that we saw in 2010 when I started with the foundation. Over the last 3 days, we've had more than 500 people walking through the door. And there are 250 that can be seated in this room. And for several panels, including this one, we've had standing room only. So those are really nice numbers here in person. But the real goal is to break through these four walls, break through the Beltway, and take these issues across the U.S. and even beyond the U.S. to the rest of the world. And so let me give you a sense of what our online audience has looked like over the last 2 days. And these are only numbers through yesterday afternoon. We've had 2,000 viewers on Oceans Live, thanks to NOAA and the work they're doing there. More than 100 viewers on average every hour that we've been broadcasting panels. We've had 18 countries across 6 continents paying attention and tuning in at one point over the last 3 days. The one continent we're missing is Antarctica. We've had 1,500 tweets from more than 600 tweets in the first 2 days alone, which leads to 7.8 million impressions. That's not a bad start. That's not a bad start for what we need to do on ocean issues. I have 3 thank yous that I want to give. The first is to you as the audience. You've been a wonderful audience. Some of you have been here pretty much from start to finish. Many of you have been coming and going, but for all of the panels, you've been really wonderful. You've been very engaged, very attentive. The questions that you've been putting into the moderators have been just great. The questions coming in from online have been really terrific. So thank you to the audience. Thank you to our sponsors. The breadth of our sponsors really reflect the breadth of interests on the ocean. We've had the sponsors listed in the program, listed on the sponsor slides, listed on the website, so I won't read off all the names. But in addition to the sponsors and the partners we have on the front side, really we can't put on CHOW and everything that takes place this week without all of the folks who don't generally get the recognition and whose names you won't find publicly. And so please indulge me while I give you the names of the staff and the volunteers who really have worked tirelessly, not just over the last couple days, but for many, many months. And starting with my staff, Katie Zakarcu, Leslie Irwin, Allison Alexander, LJ Fletcher, Catherine Anderson, Becca Samuelson, and most importantly, Shannon Yee here in the front for everything she did to put the conference together. A round of applause for my team, please. And thank you to all of you. We have a tremendous number of volunteers, but I'll give you the main ones. Pam Plakis, our volunteer coordinator, Kathy Bodring, Angela Kalos, Samantha Guidon, Debbie Heath, Megan Hepner, Rebecca Jablonski-Deal, Thomas Urban, Annie Thompson, Emery Wellman, and Chiara Zukar. I always mess up one name every year. Chihara Zuccarino Crow. Thanks to the Oceans Live team, Kate Thompson, Letice Lafir, Matt Doja, Matt McIntosh, Cici Gonzalez, Maya Walton, Alex Avila, Carly Bertrand, Benjamin Fall, Alyssa Hausman, David Ruck, and Nissa Silbiger. And of course, thanks to our photographer, Brendan Kanaki, and our event coordinator, Jordan Schneier. The final rule for the National Marine Sanctuary nomination process that was announced by John Podesta will be in tomorrow's Federal Register. Not that you all read that on a daily basis, but look for it. Next week, of course, the discussion continues on a more global perspective with Secretary Kerry's Our Ocean Conference. That will be telecast at ourocean.info. I encourage you to tune in. On the more lighthearted side, for your summer entertainment, my staff on the foundation has put together a sanctuary-themed music playlist for your summer vacation on the beach. And you could go to our website, nmsfocean.org, Ocean Summer 14. And right now, before you leave, put on your calendar next year, June 9th through 11th, will be CHOW 2015 right here in the Newseum. And so again, thank you to everybody. Thank you especially to our closing Leadership Roundtable, and I'll see you next year.